Hi, welcome to week 8 of CAT 125R. At this point in the course, you've completed your personal statement assignment as well as your expertise speech assignment, and now you're moving on to the final major assignment in the course, which is a group collaborative process in which you're curating a number of sources about a question related to intellectual property in the age of the internet. You'll be using an online tool called Storify to do this, and you can find out more information about how to use Storify by watching the videos on the course website. Your readings and lecture materials for this week are related to the question of online credibility. You are reading a source by Jessen and Jorgensen that talks about sort of the changing definition of credibility in an online environment which is focused on user-generated content. So something like Wikipedia would be an example of this. And in these scenarios, there are very few, if any, direct cues of expertise. So we can't always rely on the same sorts of questions we would ask ourselves about ethos or credibility in other environments. For example, the types of questions you responded to in your Piazza post about the Ignite style speeches. In online environments where user-generated content is central, the feedback of others becomes crucial when assessing the credibility of online information. Jessen and Jorgensen use a term called aggregated trustworthiness to describe this idea. And this is a chart from your reading which helps explain how these different factors of authority, social validation, and profile combine to create the perceived credibility of an online source. So in these situations, collective judgment and feedback become as important, if not more important, than the authority of a single author. This is because in some of these cases, authorship is often invisible or unknown, and so as readers or audience members of online content, we use different ideas, different tools to assess trustworthiness. Here's an example of a Storify story that we can use to talk about this idea of aggregated trustworthiness and the idea of collective judgment as being a tool in assessing trustworthiness. So this is a story that was created by the Sacramento Bee newspaper. I pulled this story because it was one of the featured stories on the homepage of Storify. So this is kind of an interesting example because we have an intersection of two types of authority here. We do have the sort of more traditional sense of authority, ethos, trustworthiness, in that we are working with a source that comes from an established newspaper. So we understand, we could research, if we don't already know what the Sacramento Bee is, we could see what kind of newspaper it is, and we understand that it is a sort of traditional news source in the sense that it is a printed newspaper. We can see this is a story they put together on legislation related to vaccinations in California. But what's interesting here, and this is as if we were scrolling down the Storify page, we see that it draws from sources such as Twitter, but also traditional news sources. So this first item, a California bill would require more vaccinations, is a news source from the sacramentobee.com. And then the source below it, a YouTube video of a senator discussing this legislation. So we have this intersection of traditional authority, traditional trustworthiness, with aggregated trustworthiness, right? Sources coming from a variety of locations, from a variety of authors, and we're combining those materials to create a sense of credibility. As you're working on your final project, your group curation project, you can think about what sources of credibility are available to you all. The first is your written text. So you will be writing descriptions and explanations of each source that you add to your Storify document. And there you can be sure that you are writing accurately and with the authority that we would expect from a document written for an audience as broad as the one that Storify sources are available to. Your second source of credibility is the selection of materials and their perceived credibility. This is where that idea of curation really comes into play. So you're not just choosing sources at random, you're curating them, you're selecting them carefully and with a rhetorical purpose in mind. So that selection of materials and the materials that themselves have a sense of aggregated trustworthiness, that have authority from the original source, that have social validation, and that draw on your own profile as researchers. Good luck as you get started on the assignment, and let me know if you have any questions.